Thanks, Susan. All right, so what we're going to be talking about is strategy mapping, obviously the title of today's presentation, which is one of the 9 core domains of business architecture. So we're going to talk about what is strategy mapping, benefits, principles, and guidelines, as it relates to what's called the BizBoc Guide, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. Understand some of the key concepts involved in strategy mapping, and then when we capture that content, how we might do what the Business Architecture Guild calls cross mapping, which is relating it to other concern within the business and IT architecture, how this should be exploited and used for planning and transformation, and then we'll take a look at some examples. So again, all of this information is grounded in a body of knowledge called a Guide to the Business Architecture Body of Knowledge, short version, the BizBoc Guide. And this stuff is based on version 10, which came out recently. I think version 11 may have come out since then. This is a resource that you can get some visibility into online as a guest. Basically, you can kind of look at the first chapter. But if you become a member, that's when you get one of the entitlements, which is the access to the complete BizBoc Guide. And membership is pretty affordable, like 125, 150 bucks per year. So again, for those of you on the call that are either practicing or aspiring business architects, or people that are affiliated with that, particularly like in strategic planning, digital transformation, I'd certainly recommend this as the best set of guidance out there to inform the modern business architect. And one of the things that the BizBoc Guide tries to articulate and then put into words so people can implement and practice it is what is a business architecture. And so the value proposition for business architecture is as might not be surprised when you hear the word architecture, is it's trying to provide a platform for representing an abstraction of the enterprise at a pretty high level of abstraction. Again, more, and I'll detail this in a little bit, but more talking about what a business does that is separate from how it does it, which are the implementation details, which are really important because those are key to figuring out how we're going to implement whatever the strategic change is and what those impacts are on the way that we do things now. When it's properly put together, should be a framework for allowing us to have good communication, particularly with executives and key decision makers, and provide again the backbone for doing analysis and different what if scenarios that help us really turn strategy into actionable initiatives, programs, and projects. But ultimately, business architecture is really best suited for, not that it can't be used in other places, to help us, enact those non-trivial, often traumatic transformational changes. A big part of what a lot of large organizations and even medium and small organizations have to deal with is non-trivial complexity. Some of that complexity is by design because of the nuances of the market that the company's in, but a lot of times the complexity is unnecessary. So, and it isn't adding, the value that it could. So a big part of business architecture is trying to provide a lens to look at the enterprise landscape, both from a business perspective, application, data, and technology. So we can communicate to our executive stakeholders who, don't want to get down into the gory details, which is often a pitfall some of us have in the architecture profession. Again, we need to keep things up at a high enough level so that it's meaningful and allows us to balance, the complexity that we have in our environment, but not let that affect the way that we try to communicate about what we're going to do about it. What things in the current state have perhaps unnecessary complexity, where could we do some optimization, where are some places that are doing better. But the way I often look at this is that with these practices, we're trying to become masters of complexity as opposed to becoming victims of complexity. We also want to be able to, reduce risk, make better informed decisions based on actual data, as opposed to politics, intuition, things like that. Get, all of our stakeholders across the enterprise aligned, which can be a very significant challenge and is often one of the big things that contributes or detracts from success of various strategic initiatives. And while, the BizBot Guide is, very solely focused on business architecture, it does very much recognize that in today's world, there are very few strategic initiatives that people start that don't involve some technology or, in fact, a lot of technology. So again, providing a lens into helping make some of those decisions a little bit better. But again, keeping it at the business level without getting sucked into the IT stuff too soon. And a big part of what the BizBot Guide is based on is what's called the business architecture framework. And there's the idea that there is a knowledge base of some sort of content that is managed in some fashion. Of course, many people might recognize or suggest that this is the place for some type of architecture tool, which would be definitely our position. Certainly, as you might have guessed, we are affiliated with a specific modeling tool, Sparx Enterprise Architect. But all the things that I'm going to talk about, even though I'm going to show some examples from that tool, it applies to any organization that's using any tool. And in my opinion, as a practitioner who's been doing this for a couple of decades, while I might have a particular preference because of my history, if you're really trying to modernize and uplift the today's actionable, proactive business architecture community, you need some sort of tool other than the most popular architecture tool in the world, Microsoft Office, namely, Word, Excel, Visio, PowerPoint, because that's, as many people know from experience, it is very difficult to sustain and make the connections that is necessary when you're using those more, desktop productivity tools. So, the knowledge base is centered around four what are called core domains: capability, organization, information, and value. So these are called core because they, more often than not, are four of the perspectives that a lot of organizations begin with, and they're often necessary for a lot of different types of scenarios, which you can see on the right. But then there are actually 5, not 6, as this slide suggests, extension domains. That's product, policy, stakeholder, strategy, and initiative. And those are considered extension domains because they're a little bit more volatile. So that's another thing about the core domains, is that they tend to be more stable, at least once we reach a plateau of agreement. So once you come up, for example, with your business capabilities, which represent what your business does, not how, why, or who, those are different perspectives, it is unlikely that that capability model is going to change significantly over time unless your business decides to make a dramatic change in what it does. Same thing with organization, information, and value. But the things that are on the outside, the extension domains, again, they're not applicable to all the business architecture scenarios, and they also tend to be a little bit more volatile and dynamic. Namely, they change at a more rapid pace than the ones in the middle. So what we're going to obviously be talking about is the one in the upper right about strategy. But the idea, one of the other guidance that the BizBot Guide provides is a set of business scenarios. So when we're trying to articulate why executives need to care about business architecture, there's a whole bunch. I think there's about 12 scenarios that are in the guide about what circumstances might your business encounter when it should seriously be thinking as business architecture as a tool to help them achieve those outcomes. So examples are mergers and acquisitions, a new product development, digital transformation, regulatory compliance. And again, using language that connects with the business community, because, there's some valid criticism that other frameworks, although we're trying to do the best we can, you sometimes get a little bit a little bit sucked into architectural semantics and implementation details, and we need to be really careful about. I mean, that's really important for us in the architecture community that need to understand those things, put them into place, help deploy those across the organization. But most of the consumers of business architecture are not that interested in the implementation details. So as many people say, a lot of people like eating hot dogs and sausage, but man, you do not want to know how the sausage is made. You're better off not knowing that. So we want to take a similar approach. And the BizBot guide does a pretty good job, I think, of trying to articulate this stuff, particularly in the introduction and the companion business architecture for executives document that really tries to make the case for, if you're really trying to do non-trivial things in your business in the 21st century, business architecture really needs to be an important part of your toolkit. And then the third dimension of the framework is the idea that there are a set of blueprints that we can create. And, the blueprints is just the language that the BizBot guide uses for diagrams, matrices, reports, extracts out of the architecture knowledge base that are used to frame different stakeholder concerns in different ways. But again, using a little gentler language, perhaps, than the hardcore architectural language used by frameworks like TOGAF, which we're big fans of. And just FYI, there's been a lot of alignment activities between the Business Architecture Guild and the Open Group. And in fact, in the most recent versions of TOGAF 9.2 and version 10, which was just released a couple months ago, all of the business architecture guidance in the current versions of TOGAF is very well aligned with the BizBot guide. So it's great to see some of that synergy and alignment. But one of the things that is important to differentiate is the difference between business architecture and your operating model. So again, business architecture is at a higher level of abstraction. A lot of times, not necessarily mistakenly or unsurprisingly, a lot of people, when they start thinking about how, what do we need to change? How do we need to change it? What are we going to get out of it? How are we going to do it? They immediately get into the right side, which is the operating model, which is how we do things. So for example, business processes are considered to be a part of the operating model. They are not considered to be the part of the business architecture, because business processes describe how an organization carries out a set of activities, which people perform those activities, what are some of the outcomes and decisions, again, might be represented in a typical process flow or a BPMN diagram. Again, business architecture is at a higher level of abstraction. So, just FYI, business architecture has a abstraction of business processes that are called value streams. But the whole focus of value streams is on value. That's kind of the first bullet on the left, that we want our business architecture to be driven by the value that we're providing to stakeholders, which would include both people within our organization, but most importantly, our customers, partners, and other third parties. So when we're talking about business architecture, again, it's stakeholder, value driven, capability centric, more concerned about what we do as opposed to how it's done. And again, this does not mean that we don't care about the relationship between the two. In fact, we very much do. We do want to understand, for example, which processes are the implementations of which value streams, which activities are supported by which capabilities. But in order to stay out of the gory details, which often vary across different product lines and business units across the organization, where there may be a lot of variability. Again, business architecture is trying to kind of suppress that and create a larger perspective. And of course, a big part of business architecture is it's more strategically oriented as opposed to the operating model, which is more tactical. Again, we want this to be independent of different product lines and different silos across the business. Of course, we've heard a lot over the past, decades about there being a big gap between business and IT, and that there are silos, in IT, and I think that's certainly true, given my experience, and I'm certain many folks in the meeting here today. But it's been my experience that most of the silos in IT come from silos in the business. So a big part of what business architecture is, again, trying to raise a level of abstraction so we can look at things independent of those different operating structures. And again, this whole idea that there's a lack of alignment between business and IT, I think it's actually kind of a red herring, in my opinion, which is there is actually no misalignment because of these silos and the fact that a lot of funding and propping up of initiatives is very narrowly focused. The IT organization is doing exactly what the business asks it to do. And that's the problem, is that we need, through business architecture, we can provide a broader holistic lens for looking at the entirety of the enterprise so that the business people and C-level executives, really understand the consequence of the things they're asking people to do. It doesn't mean that they're going to change their minds, but in my opinion, there's an obligation to go into these things with a full portfolio of good information to inform people about, you can do it this way. We think there's some side effects you might want to think about, and you're the decision maker. You've got that authority. You've got the budget, but here's some things you might want to think about because it might not turn out as well as you hope in the end. So again, just keep in mind that when we're talking about the 9 different domains that we talked about earlier, we're at, again, a high level of abstraction on the left side, what the architecture is, but not how it's going to be implemented. But we eventually do need to get to that because understanding that impact analysis is really an important part of the transformation planning. So what we've done is, the Business Architecture Guild has put together what's called a value stream for business architecture. TOGAF has a thing that some may be aware of called the ADM, the Architecture Development Method. And both of them are very nice, but my concern with how they're expressed is that they're really for the practitioner community. So if you're an aspiring business architect and you're trying to figure out, what should we do? How do we put it together? What do we call it? How do we work together? That kind of stuff is going to be very helpful. But it's not necessarily the best way to engage the non-architect audience. So what we did is we took basically the themes out of the BizBot guide and the TOGAF architecture development method to come up with what I hope, and I'm always open to feedback and criticism, is a way to try to describe what we do in business and enterprise architecture in a way that doesn't mention the word architecture at all. Because again, in a lot of organizations, what's interesting, that I've seen, been in this trade for, again, a couple, 2-3 decades, is architecture is this thing that, people, it's kind of episodic, and it sometimes is like a phoenix, right? It gets invested in, makes some good progress, delivers some results, and then once that's done, it kind of withers on the vines, dissipates into a pile of ashes, and then a couple of years later, it gets resurrected again. So, is it a phoenix? Is it a zombie? I'm not quite sure. And I think one of the reasons that, again, maybe not the biggest reasons, but one of the reasons that happens is that, we haven't communicated to our executive stakeholders what the outcome of this is without using the word architecture. Because as soon as we use the word architecture, there are a lot of people that are like, I have heard this story before. I watched the movie a couple times, So again, think about the fact that all this architecture stuff, which is really important for us to actually practice, these people do not care, and it's understandable. So we want to try to articulate the value that we have to offer without using that word, in my opinion. But again, this is an example of a value stream diagram that represents what we're trying to do in business and enterprise architecture. So we have a stakeholder. There may be others, but the primary stakeholder is the executive team, maybe board of directors as well. What do they want? They want improved stakeholder value, whatever that might mean. And we're going to be talking about that in just a second. And it's my position that, you know, the way that we deliver upon that value proposition is we execute the deliver strategic outcomes value stream. And it's composed of 6 different what are called value stream stages. There's 3 on the left that are what I consider to be kind of strategy at rest, which is what we're going to mostly be talking about today, a little bit into the next one. But the idea is that when we're trying to analyze the current situation to really inform what should our strategy be, we define our strategy. And of course, we'll be talking about that. And then we need to make an assessment. What are the consequences of agreeing to this strategy? And so that has to do with understanding impacts on things that are currently, you know, in flight, things that are currently operational, or things that are being considered to be added to the portfolio. But then, you know, that reason I call that strategy at rest is because we're just thinking and talking about strategy, but nothing's actually changed. It's not until we get to the second half of the value stream, strategy in motion, where we're actually starting to do planning of individual projects that are in the portfolio and how they're contributing to the overall strategic outcomes. And then we actually go into, you know, start developing solutions. So this, you know, like I said, you know, most initiatives in today's world have some component, if not a huge significant component for IT. So implement is where we would have business and IT, you know, development activities. And then once those solutions are created and deployed, we need to operate those solutions. And then there's a more detailed version of this that I don't think is in this presentation that tries to communicate that we need to have a feedback loop from operate back to analyze, because in a lot of organizations, because of the pace of change and all sorts of other dimensions, the success of a project is often measured by the fact that a solution was delivered and that maybe it meets most of its requirements and maybe it was done kind of mostly on time. But what a lot of organizations struggle with, and this is a part of where strategy mapping comes into play, is, well, what was the whole point of this initiative anyway? You know, wasn't this supposed to, you know, increase revenue or increase customer retention or, you know, reduce this operational cost or diminish this regulatory risk? You know, did any of that happen? So, you know, our perspective is to, and this is called business value realization in many frameworks, is, you know, success is not easily measured just by saying we got the project done, because the one thing you can guarantee at the end of the project is all the money's gone and all the time's gone. And hopefully you delivered something that's useful, right? But did it really deliver the business benefits, which was the basis for the justification of the investment? So again, having that feedback loop from operate back to analyze is pretty darn critical. All right, so that's kind of the big picture. So now let's dive into strategy mapping specifically. So what is a strategy map? Well, it's a way, and these are, as you might guess, quotes directly out of the BizBot guide. So it's a way to define a strategy in such a way that it can be, you know, visualized, interpreted, and acted upon. So, you know, there are a lot of people that do, you know, strategic planning within organizations, but a lot of times the evidence that they have of the work they did is not very clear. It's often not very accessible. And there may be certain audiences that might struggle with, well, what does this really mean? So, you know, one aspect of this is producing some kind of visualization that represents the strategy, but it also incorporates a set of techniques and guidelines that can help an organization figure out, you know, the trade-offs and side effects. Because as everybody knows, you know, when we make a decision to do one thing, it's got a lot of positive things that come with it, but almost everything has a consequence as well. Well, if we do this, you know, that's going to make this easier, but it's going to make that hard, or in fact, you know, impossible, or it's going to introduce some conflict. So particularly when we're doing this strategic planning across the organization, Sometimes when it's kind of done from a little bit from a bottoms up approach, or sometimes top down, bottoms up, middle, in and out, we often start to notice that there are conflicts. Hey, this business unit wants to implement this strategy, but that is in complete opposite of what this business unit wants to do. And maybe that's okay. But without knowing that from a transparency and visibility perspective, there could be all sorts of things that happen that some people might seem surprising, where if they had seen the whole thing at the beginning, they would have anticipated, like, we need to keep an eye on those two things, because there's a high degree of likelihood there's going to be some tension between them. And let's try to take some mitigating actions right now to deal with that, versus, again, being surprised later when a lot of money has been spent and a lot of time has been spent. So we always got to balance these different trade-offs. The BizBoc defines, a business strategy as, some kind of plan that, represents the entirety of an organization's significant, goals, policies, and courses of action. And again, pulling them together into a cohesive whole. And like I just said, we want to balance the top-down approach with, that are described by high-level, goals and objectives, with bottoms-up approach, and make sure things, meet together. One of the things that we've observed is that, the executive team will do strategic planning and come up with, like 4 or 5 strategic themes. And then that stuff is then, kind of shared with the next level of management at the business unit or product line. And they try to, synthesize, well, what does that mean to me? What am I going to do? And then that might go down to another level. That's actually one of the techniques we're going to talk about. It's called Hoshin Kanri. But I have found that sometimes when we get into the project portfolio and we look at the goals and benefits and objectives that a particular project is purportedly going to deliver, we often find a mismatch or a complete disconnection to, well, what does that have to do with the strategic themes that the executive team came up with? And so being able to tie all those things together to make sure that the finite amount of resources that an organization has to change its direction are actually being used to change its direction. Because another big problem a lot of organizations have is that a lot of the money they spend on a regular basis, in my opinion, and again, take this with a little grain of salt, being provocative webinar here, is really about, rearranging the furniture and repainting the walls in the same rooms of the house over and over and over again, while neglecting other parts of the house that are on fire, have holes in the ceiling and the roof where water's coming through, or, whatever. So, we really want to have, a good idea of where our investments are going, because a lot of people are trying to change the needle of how much money, how much of their budget is being used to actually affect important, significant business strategic change versus just keeping the lights on. And because of complexity, a lot of organizations spend a significant amount of their budget just keeping everything running. And that means they have a little amount of money to actually make strategic change. And so, having visibility into, those dimensions of the portfolio are pretty important as well. So, strategy mapping and some of the, deliverables that come out of it should, provide not just a representation of the choices that were made, but also, how some of those decisions were made along the way, because we need to be able to continually reevaluate those things during the execution of our transformation programs. And I'm sure you guys have heard this quote before, from General Eisenhower and President Eisenhower, in preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So we do planning to get informed about all the different dimensions, what our choices are, the pluses and the minuses. But then when we do execution, execution should not be measured by how well we follow the plan. It's, do we deliver on the objectives? Again, doesn't mean we discard the plans, but again, conformance to the plan is secondary to, did we get the job done? So a lot, what kind of practices people have in place right now is very variable. It depends a lot on the culture and the history of an organization. Some people, it's not very formal at all. And some people feel that if we try to introduce some rigor and formality into strategic planning and strategy definition, that will stifle innovation, which should not be true if you're doing it well. Again, you can think outside of the box, but still follow some general best practices and guidelines for coming up with your strategy. And then there are teams that have, rather formalized processes and actually have, teams who are specifically responsible for it, as opposed to it being an activity that the executives do, one or two times a year. But what they're all trying to do, is very similar, at least the way the BizBot guide describes it, is we often start off with what we might do or could do. All the world's our oyster, right? And then, but then we need to do kind of a reality check of, well, yeah, some of that stuff's some pretty cool ideas, but we are not ready for that for whatever reason. So then we have to kind of distill that down into what we can do. And then we want to look at it from, well, but what do we really want to do? And then, and this is where particularly where strategy mapping, becomes a good anchor for, well, what should we do? Because what we want to do and what we should do are often not the same. Sometimes there's, some overlap. So, using these strategic planning approaches should help us get from what we could do at the top to what we, must do or need to do at the bottom. So there are a set, so there are a set of benefits that the BizBot guide suggests that come from trying to formalize strategy mapping. Again, number one, and maybe not the most important, but the first one being, is it supports organizational alignment. Namely, good strategic plans, while they may start at the enterprise level, there's got to be alignment between the different operating units, product lines, whatever the org structure is. Because if you can't get the rest of the organization aligned to the strategy, then it's just a bunch of cool stuff in a PowerPoint or something. And we do generally want, everybody, at least my opinion, is, I think it's pretty important in most organizations that, this be shared, and which is kind of related to the next benefit, which is, how can individuals, particularly those that might be, just worker bees, doing their job on a day-to-day basis, how can they possibly make informed decisions about what to do or how to do things, particularly in a cycle of change, when they don't know the reason for those changes? So, so again, that leads to the second benefit, which is, doing some strategy mapping also needs to include communicating that strategy to the enterprise. And again, not just the executives and the leaders, but really, in my opinion, everybody. And so, if it's not transparent and visible, if people really don't know what the business strategy is, like I just said, how are they going to be able to navigate their day-to-day life and possibly identify an innovation that's happening right in front of them, or some sensitivity to new information that they learn by having, an engagement with a particular, partner or customer, if they don't know what the strategy is. I often think of I'm not sure how well this fits in, but just a simple analogy of whatever line cook thought about putting an egg and cheese and a sausage on an English muffin in some McDonald's restaurant, turned into a complete new line of business. But if there wasn't the ability for that person on the job floor to communicate what they thought an opportunity was, and be able to experiment with that, and then bring that to the entirety of the enterprise, a whole new line of business might have been missed. A big part of today's world, this I think this has certainly been the case forever, but it's certainly even more critical in the 21st century, is being able to adapt rapidly. Because a lot of times, what I hear a lot of people talking about in a lot of organizations is we need to be agile, even though we're not really sure what that might mean. I think agility can be defined, but in my opinion, being agile is really about being agile as a business. It has little to do with being agile as a IT organization. And I'm not saying that being agile in IT isn't helpful or useful. Don't get me wrong. I'm a big advocate of, the Scrum approach, scaled agile, all that kind of stuff. But, businesses need to be able to reevaluate their in-flight business strategy every single day. And so that, when someone learns something new, whether that's at the executive level or the point of sale customer level, things change all the time, and we need to be able to be prepared to immediately do an impact analysis of a new thing that came up this morning and how that affects the decisions and strategy that we've already put together. Because again, we don't want to blindly follow a plan just because it was set in motion. The plan is to try to achieve objectives, but sometimes those things change. And so, being agile is about being able to respond to those changes effectively and efficiently, very rapidly. And if it takes a 2-month offsite meeting to figure out how to respond to that change, you're not being terribly agile. We also want to use strategy mapping to help us, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, rationalize our initiatives and projects and programs. So, in many organizations, at any given point in time, there may be hundreds, and in many cases, in some large organizations that I've worked with, there may be thousands of projects going on every day. And, we want to make sure that we have an understanding of, how many of those projects are really kind of business as usual, rearranging the furniture projects, which, still might be okay. I'm not saying you don't do any of those, but, if 80% of your portfolio is rearranging the furniture, but you've been commanded and directed to implement this new strategy that is, non-trivial change, you might want to reevaluate that. So, for example, at least when I think from an agile software development perspective, which is really about, trying to optimize that process, right? Try to make it lean and clean, tight feedback loops, continual testing, continual integration, all that good stuff. But there's only so much you can do, right? There's a higher level optimization that you can do in agile, which is, why are we even doing this project? So there are some projects that should be, that seem like good ideas, but once you start looking into it across the whole portfolio, really don't meet the demands of the current strategic initiatives. So maybe you shouldn't do those projects. There are projects that aren't going well. Maybe you should suspend or cancel those projects. But as you guys might know, those types of discussions are not very comfortable to have, particularly with the sponsor of those projects. But having a strategy map can provide a perspective for their peers to say, hey, Bob or Jill, or I know that we all thought this was the most important thing for your team to be doing, and I know we started throwing a bunch of money and people at it, but it doesn't look like it's a really good idea anymore. We should really stop it. So again, success of a project is not spending all of the money and taking the time. It's actually delivering, results, and those results may need to change over time. When coupled with capability modeling, one of those 4 foundational domains, really helps us get a visibility into how our strategies and the initiatives that come out of those strategies, how do they relate to the capabilities that we have? And are we investing in the wrong capabilities? So for example, a lot of times, kind of related to, a different way of stating what I've said a couple times, is we often find people over investing in non-differentiating capabilities or redundant deployments for no particular advantage. So a lot of people have taken the perspective, like with the capability model, they'll often tag capabilities as being commodity capabilities, these are things everybody does to stay in business, but it's not something that we think, really distinguishes us. And then there are competitive capabilities, and then differentiating capabilities. And people have come up with different taxonomies for that over time. But generally speaking, we want to be really mindful, again, about over investing in stuff that everybody does that doesn't, doesn't offer a real value proposition either to our shareholders, our customers, so on and so forth. And without having a strategy map in place, or with a strategy map in place, it really helps us monitor how well we're progressing towards our strategic outcomes. So, and obviously this is a part of what we're trying, or what the BizBot Guide and I'm trying to do, which is is trying to sell to the executive stakeholders that are predominantly responsible for this why doing it a little bit differently might be helpful, and that as business architects we have a contribution to make. So as it relates to principles, when people are formulating their business strategies, it often relates to different, communities of interest, but those things do need to be, integrated into a holistic whole. But that, allows us to accommodate strategic planning from a lot of different stakeholder perspectives. We're creating strategies not because it's something that showed up on the calendar. It's time to do strategic planning, towards the end of the year, which might be some activities many of you are starting to work on right now. We're doing this because we're trying to respond to changes in our business ecosystem. So whether it has to do with competitors, products, regulations, things like that. We should evaluate our strategies using value analysis, which is where using value streams might be a dimension to couple with our strategy maps to help articulate that. Certainly, we want to try to take advantage of the things that we currently have in place that are going well. So we want to leverage those core capabilities, particularly, and whether they're differentiator or not. Exploit the things that we do well and try to make them even better, and make investments in other areas where we need to close a gap. And so one way to think about that progression that we introduced a couple slides ago is the first three principles represent what you might do, and the fourth principle is trying to constrain that to what we're actually capable of doing. And if we continue on with a couple, I think we got two more slides of principles here. Business strategies all by themselves are just great ideas. And so until we start identifying which initiatives and projects and programs are going to, actually implement the strategy, really is not doing too much for us. So we need to make sure that we've identified the right initiatives and we have an understanding of how they each contribute to the overall business strategy. And like I've said a couple times, a lot of organizations, just because of business as usual, they have an unhealthy focus on tactical and operational initiatives as opposed to strategic ones. And so the BizBot Guide says, once we come up with a strategy map, we need to cross map those elements of the strategy to our portfolio of initiatives so that we understand what the relationship is between the two. And again, the reason we do that is to be able to respond to change and do impact analysis. So what happens if the strategy changes? Oh, we can immediately do an evaluation of the initiatives that are tied to that strategy. And potentially change their scope and direction, and vice versa. What happens if something interesting happens on the initiative, and we need to make a decision about to go left or right? Well, we can trace that back to the strategy and have an understanding of what the consequence of different decisions might be on that. Similar to the deliver strategic outcomes value stream that we looked at earlier, unless we have some way to measure that we're actually getting closer to achieving the business strategy, again, this is all just conceptual paperwork. So we need to identify, again, ways of measuring, or at least drawing a line in the sand that says we believe that achieving this strategy means we should be able to measure this improvement in this particular metric. And so it's really important to identify those metrics, obviously, ahead of time, and then think about how the different projects and programs that are in the portfolio, how are they going to contribute to those KPIs and metrics, and is there an opportunity to instrument the solutions those projects are coming up with to actually collect and report on those metrics? And just to call out here that the principle 6 is kind of related to the third dimension of what an organization, wants to do. And then the last two principles are, perhaps stating the obvious that I've already said numerous times, is that strategies are dynamic and we need to continually look at them and evaluate them. So this gets into an interesting perspective, which is, it's one thing to, like I said, to be agile at the IT software, level. And of course, we want to try to scale that up to the entirety of the business. But one of the things that kind of comes from that, in my opinion, is strategy definition also needs to be, and strategic planning needs to be agile. And so it's not, inappropriate still to have annual, strategic planning activities. Hopefully, with the support of business architecture, those activities can happen more quickly with a higher level of confidence and credibility because we've got a good knowledge base that's tying everything together. But, we need to be prepared for regularly reevaluating our strategy, at least on a quarterly basis and maybe even a monthly basis. But, putting a strategy together at the end of 2022, funding it, pulling the trigger on it, and then crossing our fingers. And of course, I'm being a little over dramatic here, that it works out well. We need to be looking at that on a regular basis because, sometimes the information that we had at the time we did the planning or our understanding of things was just not complete, and we learned something new later. Well, changing your strategy should not be considered to be something bad. If we need to change our strategy because something came up that we didn't know about and we have to respond to it, we need to be able to do that. So again, trying to bring some agility into the strategic planning environment. And the BizBox says there's a lot of different ways, to build those strategies. The BizBox guide does not prescribe that you must do it a particular way, but does have some advice. And it's also not considered to be exhaustive, just some good ideas to start with. So we're going to take a look at a couple of common analytic frameworks, many of which I'm sure some of you have used in the past. But ultimately, the ninth and last principle is trying to get us to focus on, what are we actually able to do and what is necessary to do. So there are basically a couple of different frameworks that the BizBot guide offers out of general business knowledge that can help us here. So one of them one dimension has to do with what the BizBot guide is called opportunity identification. So what are some of the business opportunities we have? And so there's the ANSOF product market grid, SWOT analysis, 5 forces model. And again, these are not presumed to be all of the analytical frameworks, but just some common ones historically, and then some formal mapping techniques, including Norton Kaplan strategy maps, the business motivation model, and Hosch and Conray. So what we're going to do now is we're going to spin through each 6 of those and start looking at some examples. So the ANSOF product market grid, this is something that came up in the late 50s. And it's, tries to get us to think about the product and market landscape using a typical kind of 2x2, where the vertical dimension, has to do with current and new products, and the horizontal dimension has to do with current and new markets. And basically, he's just asking you, for not necessarily as the enterprise as a whole, but different, product lines and business units. Where are you at and where do you want to go? So, hey, we've got, existing products, and what we're really trying to do is really not so much change our products, but get further embedded into our current marketplace. So that maybe means we're going to take more of a market penetration strategy, as opposed to the opposite corner where we want to introduce new products into new markets, because that's a dimension for helping diversify our product and customer portfolio. But just because this came, some people came up with this stuff, over 60, years ago, does not mean it's still not suitable. But there is an acknowledgement that things might be a little bit more complicated than this in the 21st century. But something to think about. And then there's the SWOT analysis. This came up, in the late 60s. I have seen this to be still a very popular technique as a way of evaluating our ability to respond to a strategy. So as many people know, SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But what's interesting is that when we put this into context with business architecture and the practices advised by the Guild, the internal perspective, which is about strengths and weaknesses, what you're really doing is you're characterizing your capabilities. So here's a capability we're good at. We have a strength there. Here's a capability. We have some opportunities for improvement. So that's a weakness. So when we think of strengths and weaknesses, it's really a way, again, to talk about our capabilities. And again, that's one of the four core foundational domains. And then when we think about opportunities and threats, those tend to be related to two other dimensions of business architecture, namely value streams and products. So again, we can take this tried and true technique that I still use, and I know lots of other people do, but we can use this to help characterize the business architecture landscape using some traditional techniques. So one of the advantages of this is that, we're trying to introduce some new ways of doing stuff with all this business architecture stuff, but we can still provide connections to a technique that people have been using for decades, and talk about how they can be used together. And then there's Michael Porter, who's written a lot of good strategy books over the multiple decades of his career. Came up with this that many of you have heard of, is called the 5 forces model, where the horizontal dimension is, again, about threats. And so there's threats of people that are already in our market, threats of new competitors entering the market. There's threats of people substituting our solution for just a completely different way of looking at it. And then we've got to balance that with the bargaining power of our suppliers, which help can challenge our cost structure, and then the bargaining powers of customers, which can compromise our pricing structure. So, and in the book and and additional guidance, as some may know, there's a lot of candidate factors for you to evaluate in each of these 5 different force vectors. And then there's the more formal mapping techniques, and probably one of the more popular ones, mostly because this has been around for a couple of decades. Supported by some good work by these guys through the books and white papers they've created, for example, through the Harvard Business School Press. So, this is probably something that many senior executives have heard of, because when they got their MBA, almost certainly this was brought up. But, just as a quick aside, one of the reasons that we still have the challenge about business people thinking business architecture and enterprise architecture is important is because many of them did not learn that when they got their MBAs, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that is finally changing, because you can now go and get a master's degree in business architecture. And because of that, there are adjunct programs that are injecting some of that stuff into other programs like MBA. So hopefully things will get better in the future, but a lot of times we still have to sell this stuff. Unlike, and as I'm sure some of you have thought upon occasion, well, you really don't have to sell, the C-level executives that we need to do accounting or finance or GRC. I mean, duh. HR? Oh, I really don't like HR. It's really complicated. Let's not do that. So, business and enterprise architecture are still kind of moving up the maturity scale as it relates to an accepted practice. But, there is a way that we can, if people are find the Norton Kaplan strategy approach to be useful and helpful, we can connect our business architecture to that traditional approach as well. And it's basically, talks about there being 4 different perspectives. There's obviously the the money perspective, and it basically identifies, kind of that long-term shareholder value as ultimate, at least for, publicly traded companies, and that there are, four, dimensions about finance that have to do with improving costs, i.e. reducing it, increasing utilization of our assets, which could include people, and IP, expanding our opportunities to make more money, enhancing value. So it kind of has a predefined set of categories for each of these four dimensions. And then what you're asked to do, so accompanying, so this is one of the nice things about this technique, is that in addition to having a way of consistently representing strategy using that Norton Kaplan strategy map, it also has a way of capturing measurements and metrics. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this. It's called the Balanced Scorecard, or BSC. So there's a whole bunch of predefined KPIs and metrics for each of the four levels that you can start with. So again, you're not inventing this strategy and measurement framework from scratch. And here is an example of a balanced scorecard. So you can see the same four horizontal dimensions of finance, customer, internal, and learning. And then you can see a couple of strategic objectives, increasing profitability, optimizing revenue, increasing customer profitability. Again, these are some of the common ones that apply to virtually every organization. Again, what they really mean in practice, is very variable, but, most companies want to make more money, right? And then there's some KPIs associated with that, percent net margin profit, actual net cash flow, cost per call abandon rate or fallout. And then basically trying to come up with a representation of where are we at today, the current, and where do we want to get to? So in the future, state target architecture, we want to improve, either make the numbers go up or make the numbers go down. And then you'll notice this particular scorecard has a frequency measure about whether this is done monthly or quarterly. And then how are these associated with programs? And so what the BizBot guide would call initiatives, and the budgets associated with that. There's also a formal modeling approach towards this, and this is the one I tend to get attracted to. Now, I'll admit I have a bias for modeling because that's a big part of what I do as an architect and what I help our customers do. So it may not be necessarily for everybody, but I do want to give people a little bit of an introduction into this, just in case you find yourself in a situation where you might be able to leverage this. So the whole, and then the BizBot guide actually uses a simplified version of this to kind of at least get going. But what I find pretty compelling about the business motivation model, which is a standard from the Object Manager Group, the OMG, is that it's trying to, it's a international standard for how we represent strategic plans. Because what I find, many organizations, there's a lack of agreement about the language we use to actually construct a strategic plan. And perhaps you guys have noticed it as well, is that people very casually, and I don't think it's deliberate, it's just kind of a second order effect, but they use the words goals, objectives, strategy, and tactic interchangeably. Or one person uses the words one way and someone else uses them a different way. And what the BMM is trying to introduce is some standard definitions of these words, so that when we talk about the elements of a strategic plan, we're not confusing each other any more than we're probably already confusing people. So what I like about this is that it uses pretty familiar business language. I seriously would urge people that are interested in taking a closer look at this to actually download the standard from the OMG's website. And unlike other standards, which can be a little pedantic and esoteric, the BMM standard is very well written. It definitely tries to approach the architect community, but it also provides a lot of really good examples. Like, can you give me an example of the difference between a strategy and a tactic? And I'll try to provide a little bit of visibility into that in just a second. But it uses the language, there's a means to an end. right? And so, but there's three different levels of abstraction of the means. So we have a very high level mission. That mission then needs to be turned into a set of courses of actions. And there are two levels of those, strategies and tactics. And then the means are going to be constrained by directives, and which are policies and rules. So these directives either prescribe that you must do something a certain way because of organizational or regulatory policy, or you cannot do it a certain way for the same reasons. And then the ends is only two levels. We got the big picture, the vision, right? We got our mission statement, our vision statement. Most of these things already exist in a lot of organizations, but then it says, well, the end, the way that we determine where we're all trying to go is we try to synthesize a set of desired results, and there's two levels of those, goals and objectives. And then there are assessments, things that represent our research about how prepared we are to handle those things. And as you might not be surprised, what the BMM calls an assessment suggests that there might be four categories: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Again, doesn't prescribe that, but says you can start with that. And then there are influencers, of which there are two sets, internal and external. And some other frameworks call these drivers, namely what things are happening within your organization and outside your organization in the marketplace that are causing you to change the way you do things. And so these are all the dimensions of the kinds of data we need to collect to put together a comprehensive strategic plan. And then I'm going to show you some simple contrived examples to hopefully give you a little bit more meat on why it might be good to examine this a little bit more closer and use formal modeling tools to capture this content. So here we have an example of a business strategy for a bank using BMM and using some contrived symbols for them. But you can see we've got stuff about the means on the left. So we got the mission, which is that globe icon. The mission is supported by 4 strategies. Those are the horse, the rook chess pieces. And then those strategies are delivered through tactics. So again, strategies are, an indication of a course of action, but they're not actionable. They're not concise enough. They give you the idea, but you're like, I could do this and I could do that. And both of them seems like they'd be, getting us in the right direction. But that's exactly what tactics are for. The way that you operationalize a strategy. And really a tactic is, this is what we're going to do. So in this case, we want to manage operating costs. Sounds like a good idea as a strategy, but what do you mean by that? Oh, we're going to automate processes and we're going to consolidate processes. Again, whether that's the right decision or not, that's the whole point of putting this together, so that we can have a dialogue with our stakeholders across the enterprise. And then we've got kind of in the middle, we've got the ends. So that would be the vision. That is supported by a set of goals. Those are kind of the checkered flags. So we want to gain market share, reduce operating cost, improve customer satisfaction. But those are still squishy. It's like, what do you mean improve customer satisfaction? And I personally, most of the goals that are underneath it, which are the target symbols, aren't great. A couple of them are okay, but because as some may know, this is embraced by the BizBot Guide and TOGAF and many other frameworks, is that our objectives, the thing that makes an objective different from a goal is objectives need to be quantifiable. And that means they need to be SMART, right? Specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time bound. And just to, provide a silly example, if we didn't clarify what improved customer satisfaction is, with something measurable and clear, particularly as a customer, I'd say, you'd make me darn happy and a customer forever if you gave your product away for free. That would really make me happy. But, obviously that's, nonsense. But, until you clarify, what do you mean improve customer satisfaction? What does that mean? So the objectives, again, should clarify the goals. And then on the right, we have really the directives. And those are the policies and rules that dictate what choices are permissible or not permissible. But one of the things that we want to do, if we put this together in a, in my opinion, unsurprisingly, in a some kind of a repository or a knowledge base, is we want to be able to not just do kind of this decomposition, of means into mission, strategy, tactic, ends into vision, goals, objectives. We also want to make sure that horizontally it makes sense. Namely, one of the best practices is that every strategy must have a goal. And every goal must have a strategy, because if we have a strategy without a goal, the question is, why are we doing this? And if we have a goal without a strategy, how are we actually achieving this? So we need to have, complete traceability between each level. And then similarly, we need the same kind of traceability at the tactic and objective level. So every objective has to be related to a tactic, and every tactic has to be related to an objective. And of course, this is a very simple high-level model, but I'm sure some of the stuff that you guys put together across some of your organizations, it's not this simple. It's this times 5 or times 10. But to me, that's an even more important acknowledgement that trying to do this in desktop productivity tools without a strategy for strategic planning, brings with it significant risk. But then we've got the whole idea that, this might, the previous slides might represent what the enterprise business strategy is, but then we need to flow that down to different operating units. So in this case, we've got the commercial bank side of the bank and the retail consumer side of the bank. Well, guess what? They've got their own means to an end. So they've got their own mission and vision and strategy and tactics and goals and objectives. But what we want to make sure is that we understand how those lower level plans, trace and roll up to the enterprise plan. So again, I didn't spend much time trying to come up with good words for the business unit stuff. So I just abbreviated them with, CM strategy, so CM is the commercial strategy 1, CMS2 is the commercial strategy 2, so on and so forth. But the idea is that we want to make sure that all of the enterprise strategies, for example, like manage operating costs, those have to be traced probably, well, at least to one, operating unit, right? Because if nobody is doing anything at the operating unit level to manage operating costs, well, then we're not going to deliver on that for the enterprise. But doing this traceability, not just informs us to make sure we don't have any major disconnects in our future execution, but it also identifies opportunities for synergy, because a lot of times when we're doing this planning, kind of top down and then into different business units, and sometimes it's bottoms up a little bit, different initiatives in different parts of the company really don't have perhaps a lot of awareness of each other. And this is an opportunity to say, hey, you guys are both trying to contribute directly or indirectly to the same, corporate goal. Maybe you guys should work together. I mean, maybe not, but you should at least consider it. And let's make sure that you guys aren't taking the organization in 2 different directions. It's okay, for example, on the very left, where there's a business unit strategy, CMS1, that does not map to an enterprise strategy. That's okay, because there's, we often want to give different business units and product lines, some flexibility to do innovation, that makes sense for their customer and their markets that may not be directly related to the goals of the enterprise. But we might be concerned if all of a business unit's objective strategies had nothing to do with the corporate, or if they had no local strategy. So again, what the right response is really depends on the circumstances. But if we don't know that there's a relationship or a gap, how can we have that conversation? The thing that we do, again, want to be really mindful about is shown here. So if we, again, have a goal of improving customer satisfaction, and we can't trace that to any goal that's being done by a different product line or business unit, then we need to be asking some serious questions like, well, either that's no longer a goal because nobody's doing it, or we need to make sure these other business units, get aligned with this. So again, this is the whole point of this, is to bring visibility and transparency to this complexity so that we can, again, make informed decisions as early as possible when we're putting together the initiatives that come out of our strategic planning. One of the other formal techniques that's talked about in the guide is called the Hoshin Kanri, which talks from Japanese. I guess I'm not a native Japanese speaker, as you probably guessed, but is loosely translated as policy deployment, or the way I think about it is kind of policy flow down. And this was, built on some of the best practices of some of the leaders and founders of quality movement, namely Deming, Duran, and Ishikawa, that kind of culminated back in the mid 70s. But even though it's 40 plus 50 years old, still means it's okay. But this is the idea that kind of what I've been speaking to the whole time, is we want to tie all this stuff together. We want to make sure our goals are traced to our objectives and vice versa. And then we want our objectives to be traced to actual initiatives that we've funded that are going to be, delivering some new improved capability. And we want those initiatives to be traced to be measured by KPIs that are traced back to the goals. So again, it's really about creating an integrated strategic plan. And one of the things, if you do some more research on this, is they talk about how this cube kind of rotates as it flows down. So it starts off at the executive level, and then it goes down to the business unit product line level, and then it goes down to the product level, and then it goes down to the team level. But the whole point is we want to make sure that we have connections all the way from the bottom in between, all the way up to the top, so that when something changes, not if, but when something changes, we can immediately assess the impact upstream and downstream from a strategy perspective. And then when it comes to formal modeling, according to the BizBot guide, there are two important concepts. Those are the ones that are in blue on this diagram: strategy and objective. And there was a time, I think there was an arrow backwards here. So yeah, an objective realizes a strategy. So strategies are, again, the more bigger picture things, and objectives are a little bit more fine grained. Again, this is a simplification of the business motivation model, because what's missing from this, which could be added if you needed it to, is tactics and goals. So in practice, the examples I'm going to show you are going to keep simple like this, but it's often necessary to introduce those two other dimensions as well. But this is trying to represent not just what's the relationship between objectives and strategies, but how objectives and strategies are related to other dimensions of the business architecture. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but stakeholders own strategies and objectives. Those are typically our C-level executives. A objective is going to, or a strategy might impact a capability. It might align with a value stream, impact products, and be influenced or be governed by policies. And so, again, we've got an opportunity to create a pretty rich canvas for not just describing the business strategy itself, but then how it relates to the rest of the landscape. So here's a simple example where we've got, again, this is an example of a model we might build in Enterprise Architect, and you could do something similar in other tools as well. So the brown box in the middle represents an initiative, the actual strategic initiative. So we want to do some CRM improvement. And what are we trying to get out of that? Well, we've got a set of objectives, which are the purple boxes on the right. So we want to shorten time between interaction and verification. We want to reduce non-automated data sharing, improve regularity and reliability of campaigns, so on and so forth. So this is why we want to do this. And then, since this is very early on in the process, we're trying to say, well, who's funding that? It's the marketing organization, and this is certainly going to impact the CRM capability. Not exhaustively, but like an initial kind of quick assessment. But then what we want to do is we want to, again, formulate that strategy. So this is the actual strategy map, or an example of one based on BizBot best practice. So we have the stakeholders at the top. marketing director, operations manager, sales director. We can see the objectives they own and are responsible for. And these are the same 4 boxes, we saw in the previous diagram. But then, and again, how we do this, whether we do it bottoms up or top down, really depends. A lot of times people start with these goals and objectives, and then they go, how are we going to do that? But sometimes you're like, I know we need to do this, but now we need to think about why. So it really depends. But in this case, we came up with objectives, and then by using some of the techniques that we talked about earlier, we came up with 5 strategies. We need to understand lead sources and life cycles, consolidate the information, retire custom apps, plan targeted campaigns, blah, blah, blah. And those 5 strategies all added up together comprise the overall CRM strategy. And this is trying to recognize that within an organization, there are many different strategies, not just at different levels of abstraction, but in different subject areas. So this, again, is a part of the strategic plan for an enterprise that's focusing on customer relationship management. And then the BizBot guide says that, once we've got an idea what our, goals and objectives are, now we can, and some of their metrics, now we need to figure out, what we're going to do. And again, the diagram I showed earlier kind of is a visual representation of some of what you're seeing here. So, we need to come up with those goals and objectives and strategies, figure out the KPIs and metrics, and then what the BizBot guide called action items, which again can be considered courses of action, of which the BMM says there are 2. Strategies and tactics. Then we want to identify, again, this is a generalization, so it may not be exactly what you do in all circumstances, but it's probably a good start that, if you happen to have a collection of value streams already identified, you could say, hey, this goal of knowing the customer is going to likely impact these 5 value streams. And again, the nature of those impacts we haven't got to yet. We're going to do some more research on that and get back to you. It's also going to impact these 5 capabilities, and it's going to impact these initiatives that are already funded and either on the, are waiting to get started, or perhaps are in flight already. And again, think about the 9 different domains that the business architecture has. So these are the 3 that are most likely to be most important: value, capability, and initiative. But there are, 5 more that you might want to consider as well. And so we can see some of that here. So this is a way that I might visualize the words that were on the previous table. And again, I certainly have a bias that I do lots of modeling. I've had the privilege of using modeling tools like this for pretty much the entirety of my career. So it's second nature. Namely, I've become so accustomed to modeling, I'm not sure I can do my job without doing modeling. It's just so ingrained into my day-to-day thinking and practice. But you could do similar things, in Visio and Word. But again, the challenge is it's going to be really hard to scale that. So the whole idea is that we've got the 5 strategies that we saw earlier in the strategy map in the second swim lane, and then above it we've got some policies. So our data retention and security policies are going to govern how we deliver upon those first 2 strategies, because they have to do with potentially a PII. And again, what our policies are for keeping data archives. Then there's some value streams that might be impacted by some of those strategies. Then below that, we've identified the capabilities that are likely going to be impacted by realizing those strategies. And then we have some assessments. And so those are the strengths. In the case of capabilities, those are strengths and weaknesses. And just because of brevity, we don't have the opportunities and threats on this diagram, but if we did, they would likely be traced to the red icons in the upper right, which are value streams. But this again is an opportunity for us to discuss with our stakeholders. This is what we all agreed to, and now we're starting to begin the impact analysis. And now let's have some discussions about that. And we also, in addition to putting, rectangles on diagrams and drawing lines, we can also, many tools have the ability to visualize this in a traceability matrix, which is, again, most tools will pull that out of the same repository so that the diagrams and the matrices are consistent. And then it turns out that, in this case, when we started the initiative, we thought there was one initiative with 4 objectives. But then as we started doing a little bit more research, we're like, a big part of CRM improvement is going to be dependent on operations improvement. So this is actually the diagram where the arrow is backwards. So that arrow depends upon should be pointing from CRM to operations. So it's backwards. So because we really want to try to separate that, hey, in order for us to improve CRM, we've got to improve some other things that aren't CRM, but they're related to CRM. And so that had to do with, basically taking the 4 sets of the 4 objectives, making 2 of them CRM specific, and then making 2 of them operations specific. And then, this kind of result, this is kind of the outcome of doing a lot of the business and enterprise architecture work, which is now that we have 2 initiatives, which are the big brown boxes, CRM and operations improvement, we decided that we were going to do 5 solution delivery projects to implement this initiative. And just FYI, SF has to do with Salesforce. So we're going to do Salesforce event management, training management, engagement management, and license management. And then we still do this. WP is WordPress. So we're going to create a resource portal in WordPress. So this one initiative turned into 5 projects. And these 5 projects are contributing in different ways to the same 2 objectives that are related to the initiative. And then trying to do the same thing for the other initiative. And then we should be able to then do a more broader analysis of, again, now that we're down at the solution delivery project level as opposed to the initiative level, which of these solution delivery projects, which value streams do they impact, and which capabilities do they impact? And it's particularly the relationships to capability that can be very informative when putting together this portfolio. So for example, here we have 2 solution delivery projects touching the same capability. Well, that clearly means that we need to be mindful about the sequencing of these, because, and there's 3 different approaches, right? Engagement management goes first and, makes changes to training delivery. And then whatever changes are incorporated are then going to be available to the next project, training management. Or maybe we do it the other way around. Maybe training management should be the first to improve training delivery, and then engagement management the second. And of course, the third option is, well, maybe because of complexities and constraints and timings, we need to do them both at the same time. But that means we really have to do some good coordination between those projects. The other thing that we want to be mindful about is where we have, and we've chosen a slightly different line style to represent this, that, the impacted capabilities are the ones that have solid lines, but the required capabilities are the dashed lines. And required capabilities is one of the dimensions that we often see in project plans and project charters, which are assumptions and dependencies. So for example, what the event management project has an assumption. While we're building out the new event management capabilities, whatever they happen to be, we are assuming that we need or we require the training delivery capability, which means during our project, we are expecting that training delivery is not going to change. That is an assumption. Therefore, this brings up the sequencing and coordination discussion to say, well, it's actually not as simple as just between, does engagement happen first or training happen first? But we also need to think about how it relates to event management. So if event management is dependent on training delivery, it may not be a great idea to do event management before training management and engagement management. Again, sometimes we got to do what we got to do, but at least, having a view into how these different projects touch the same things and different things is a very useful perspective to have, again, when putting together our portfolio. So I know, Susan, at the beginning, I was like, I'm not sure if, this is going to be 90 minutes, but I opened my mouth and
that's fine.
Thus runneth over. So we are pretty much at the end of our session. We got a couple minutes for questions, and but also I'm more than willing to follow up with people afterwards as well.
Can you give some organic innovation examples?
Perhaps I may not be the greatest source for that, but one that I was trying to do was from, again, what I have heard. So I'm not in the know, so it might be an urban, myth. But again, the whole idea of a line cook in some restaurant, in some McDonald's, thinking, hey, we could make breakfast, even though it was not a part of the menu, and they did. That became a local success. Got bubbled up to the executives, and I think the guy or gal who invented it's now an executive at McDonald's. But I'm sure there is no shortage of other organic kind of bottoms up innovations. But I'll apologize that I don't have many more at the tip of my fingers.
And yes, we had another question. Could you please share slide 33 again as well?
Sure. So this is really, ironically, with all the other stuff we talked about, this is what's considered the strategy map, an articulation of at least the objectives and the strategies and who cares. All the other diagrams are how the strategy map is cross-mapped to capabilities, value streams, initiatives, and other stuff.
Okay, great. Let's see, another question on this slide. How do you see new businesses starting with these mapping fundamentals on slide 33?
So a new business kind of being a startup, I presume. So something that really hasn't been in operation yet. I would think, there would be a number of strategies that the startup has. So, a lot of times, maybe a startup might take more of a top-down approach, which is, what are we trying to do? And because they're perhaps less concerned about improving operational efficiency, which is often what a lot of people are focused on. Again, there's a difference between reducing cost and making more money, even though sometimes they're related. So a startup might be more strategy oriented because they don't really have a business. And so some of these, improvement metrics might be really tough to put your finger on, as opposed to coming up with a set of objectives and then trying to come up with the strategy. So not sure if that, exactly answers the question, but that's the best I got.
Oh, she said, thank you. Okay. Yes, thank you, she said. Perfect. Chris, thank you so much for your time and for presenting with us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.